My name is Tom Dillon, and I'm about to tell you how I turned my wife's betrayal into her complete destruction. Not with violence, not with anything illegal, just with patience, planning, and the kind of cold calculation that comes from 20 years in IT security consulting. You learn a lot about human vulnerabilities in my line of work. People always leave traces, digital fingerprints, patterns of behavior that reveal their true intentions. Julia thought she was clever. She wasn't. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in my home office, debugging a client's firewall, when Julia walked in wearing that fake smile she'd been practicing lately, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Tom, honey, I need to talk to you about something," she said, perching on the edge of my desk like she used to when we were newlyweds. Back then, it was charming. Now it felt calculated. "What's up?" I didn't look away from my screen. 3 years of marriage counseling had taught me that direct eye contact during these conversations usually led to fights. "It's about the safe deposit box. I think we should add my name to the access list." That got my attention. I swiveled my chair around, studying her face. Julia was beautiful in that polished real estate agent way, blonde highlights perfectly maintained, makeup always flawless, clothes that cost more than most people's rent. But I'd learned to read the micro-expressions beneath the surface. "Why?" I asked. "Well, what if something happens to you? I'd need access to our important documents." "Nothing's going to happen to me, and you know where everything is." Her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Tom, don't be difficult. It's just practical." Practical. Julia's favorite word when she wanted something I wasn't ready to give. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch between us. In IT security, you learn that the person who talks first usually reveals more than they intended. "I'll think about it," I said finally. The mask slipped for just a moment. I saw irritation flash across her features before the smile returned. "Of course, no rush." After she left, I sat staring at my computer screen, but the code had lost my attention. 22 years of marriage, and Julia had never shown interest in our financial arrangements. She handled her real estate business. I managed our investments and savings. It worked. So why the sudden concern about the safe deposit box? I pulled up our joint checking account online. Nothing unusual. Credit cards looked normal. But something nagged at me, the same instinct that had made me good at finding security vulnerabilities in corporate networks. That evening, I watched Julia more carefully during dinner. Our kids, Emma and Max, were their usual teenage selves, Emma chattering about college applications, Max absorbed in his phone between bites. Julia participated in the conversation, but there was a distracted quality to her responses, like she was running calculations in her head. "Dad, you're being weird," Emma said suddenly. "How so?" "You're staring at Mom like she's a suspect in one of those crime shows you watch." Julia laughed, but it sounded forced. "Your father's just tired. Aren't you, honey?" "Something like that," I said. Later that night, after the kids went upstairs, Julia curled up next to me on the couch while I pretended to watch television. She smelled different, a cologne I didn't recognize, subtle but definitely there. "Tom," she said softly, "I've been thinking about us lately." "What about us?" "We've been together so long, sometimes I wonder if we still really see each other, you know?" I muted the TV and turned to face her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, when was the last time we really talked? About our dreams, our fears, what we want from life?" This was new territory. Julia wasn't typically introspective. "I don't know. What do you want to talk about?" She was quiet for a moment, and I could see her choosing her words carefully. "I've been feeling restless lately, like maybe I need some space to figure things out." Space. "Not separation," she said quickly. "Just room to breathe. Maybe I could stay at Sarah's place a few nights a week. Give us both some perspective." Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. Sarah Whitman, Julia's best friend and fellow real estate agent. They'd been inseparable since Julia started working at Prestige Properties 5 years ago. Sarah was divorced, lived alone in a downtown condo, and had strong opinions about marriage that she shared freely at dinner parties. "If that's what you need," I said. Julia looked surprised, like she'd expected an argument. "Really? You're okay with it?" "Julia, we're adults. If you need space, take it." She kissed my cheek, and I caught that unfamiliar scent again. "Thank you for understanding." Understanding. Right. The next morning, I did what any IT security consultant would do when faced with suspicious behavior. I started gathering data. I wasn't proud of it, but 22 years of marriage had earned me the right to protect myself. Julia's phone was easy. We'd shared passwords for years, and she'd never changed hers. Her text messages revealed a pattern of late-night conversations with someone named P that were suspiciously vague. "Can't wait to see you." "Tom's working late again." "This is getting complicated." Her email was more revealing. Correspondence with a divorce attorney named Val Morrison. Not just casual inquiries, detailed discussions about asset division, custody arrangements, and something called strategic positioning for optimal settlement outcomes. But the real revelation came from her browser history. Julia had been researching my inheritance from my father, who'd passed 2 years ago. She'd visited the bank's website multiple times, looking up information about safe deposit box procedures, joint account access, and estate documentation. My father had left me a substantial sum, not millions, but enough to change our lives significantly. Julia knew about it, of course, but I'd been careful about the details. The money was tied up in investments and trusts designed to provide long-term security for our family, but Julia apparently thought it was sitting in that safe deposit box, waiting to be claimed. I leaned back in my chair, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The sudden interest in box access, the request for space, the divorce attorney consultations. Julia wasn't just having an affair, she was planning a strategic exit, time to maximize her financial gain. P had to be Peter Vale, her business partner at Prestige Properties. I'd met him at company events, a smooth-talking guy in his mid-30s with expensive suits and a habit of standing too close to other men's wives. He drove a flashy Audi and wore cologne that probably cost more per ounce than my hourly consulting rate. The irony was almost amusing. Julia thought she was being clever, positioning herself for the perfect divorce settlement. She had no idea that her husband spent his days thinking like a criminal, anticipating every possible attack vector, planning defenses for scenarios that hadn't even occurred yet. I opened a new document on my computer and started typing. If Julia wanted to play strategic games, I'd give her a master class in long-term planning. The first step was misdirection. I needed Julia to believe she was winning while I prepared my real response. Over the next few days, I played the role of the oblivious husband perfectly. When she mentioned staying at Sarah's, I nodded sympathetically. When she worked late, showing properties, I didn't ask questions. When she suggested we take a break from heavy conversations, I agreed readily. Meanwhile, I was busy. I moved the real inheritance documents to a new location. I set up monitoring on our joint accounts. I researched Peter Vale's background and found some interesting inconsistencies in his business dealings. And I started documenting everything: screenshots, printed emails, a detailed timeline of Julia's activities. Emma noticed the change in household dynamics first. She was 17, sharp as a blade, and had inherited my talent for reading people. "Mom's acting weird," she said one evening while helping me with dishes. "How so?" "She's being too nice, like fake nice, and she keeps checking her phone during dinner." "Maybe she's just stressed about work." Emma gave me a look that said she wasn't buying it. "Dad, I'm not 10. I know when adults are lying." I dried a plate slowly, considering my response. What do you think is going on? I think Mom's having an affair. The plate slipped from my hands, clattering into the sink. Emma's directness had caught me off guard. That's a serious accusation, I said. It's not an accusation if it's true. Emma's voice was matter-of-fact, but I could see hurt in her eyes. She's been getting texts at weird hours. She smiles different when she reads them. And yesterday I saw her putting on perfume before going to show a house at 8 p.m. I put my arm around my daughter's shoulders. Em, even if that were true, it wouldn't change how much your mother loves you and Max. But it would change everything else, wouldn't it? Smart girl. Too smart for her own good sometimes. Let me handle the adult stuff, okay? Your job is to be 17 and worry about college applications. She nodded, but I could see she wasn't satisfied with my response. Emma was going to be watching now, and Julia had no idea how observant her daughter could be. That weekend, Julia announced she was spending Saturday night at Sarah's place. Girl time, she said with that practiced smile. We're going to drink wine and complain about men. Sounds fun, I said. Tell Sarah I said hello. After Julia left, I took the kids out for pizza and a movie. Normal family time, the kind we'd been having less of lately. Max was quieter than usual, but he was 15, and quiet was his default setting. Emma kept checking her phone, and I suspected she was monitoring her mother's social media activity. We got home around 10 p.m. I was helping Max with a history project when Emma appeared in the doorway of his room, holding her phone. Dad, you need to see this. The screen showed Sarah's Instagram story. Sarah and Julia were indeed together, but they weren't alone. Peter Vale was in the background of one photo, his hand resting on Julia's shoulder in a way that was definitely not professional. That's Mom's business partner, Emma said. Peter something. Peter Vale, I said automatically. You know him? I've met him at company parties. Emma studied my face carefully. Are you okay? Was I okay? My wife was having an affair with her business partner while planning to divorce me and steal my inheritance. My 17-year-old daughter was conducting better surveillance than most private investigators, and I was standing in my son's bedroom, looking at photographic evidence of my marriage falling apart on social media. I'm fine, I said, but maybe don't mention this to your brother yet. Emma nodded. What are you going to do? Good question. What was I going to do? I was going to do what I did best, think like a security consultant, anticipate every possible move, and plan a response that would leave my opponents wondering what had hit them. I'm going to be very, very careful, I said. Monday morning brought the next phase of Julia's plan, though she didn't know I was expecting it. I was in my office, ostensibly working on a penetration test for a healthcare client, when I heard her car pull into the driveway. She wasn't alone. Through my window, I watched Julia emerge from her BMW, followed by a woman in a severe black suit carrying a leather briefcase. Val Morrison, I presumed. The divorce attorney looked exactly like Central Casting would order for aggressive legal counsel, sharp angles, predatory smile, and the kind of confidence that came from years of dismantling marriages for profit. They walked up to my front door like they owned the place. In Val's mind, they probably did. The doorbell rang twice, sharp and insistent. I took my time answering, making sure to look appropriately surprised when I opened the door. Julia, what's going on? Who's your friend? Tom, this is Val Morrison, my attorney. Julia's voice had a different quality now, harder, more businesslike. The pretense of the struggling wife was gone, replaced by someone ready for battle. Attorney? I let confusion creep into my voice. Why do you need an attorney? Val stepped forward, extending her hand with practiced efficiency. Mr. Dillon, I'm representing your wife in some financial matters that require immediate attention. I shook her hand, noting the firm grip and calculating eyes. Financial matters? May we come in? Julia asked, though she was already moving past me into the foyer. I led them to the living room, the same space where Julia and I had shared that conversation about needing space just 2 weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Val opened her briefcase with theatrical precision, removing a folder thick with legal documents. "Mr. Dillon, we have a court order requiring you to provide immediate access to safe deposit box number 847 at First National Bank." She handed me the papers, and I made a show of reading them carefully. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Julia had convinced a judge that she needed emergency access to marital assets for her protection and welfare. "I don't understand," I said, looking between them. "Julia, why didn't you just ask me? I told you I'd think about adding your name to the access." "Tom, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Julia's voice carried a note of impatience. "The court has ruled that I have the right to access our joint assets." "Joint assets," I repeated slowly. "Julia, that box contains my father's inheritance, documents and items that belonged to my family for generations." Val leaned forward, her smile sharp as a scalpel. "Mr. Dillon, any assets acquired during the marriage are considered marital property under state law. Your father's inheritance, regardless of its sentimental value, falls under that category." I stared at the court order, letting silence fill the room. In my peripheral vision, I could see Julia fidgeting, her confidence wavering slightly. She'd expected anger, arguments, maybe even tears. My calm acceptance was throwing her off script. "When do you need the key?" I asked finally. Val checked her watch, a gold Rolex that probably cost more than most people's cars. "The bank is expecting us at 2 p.m. That gives us time to review the contents and secure any items that require immediate attention." "Immediate attention," I echoed. "Such as?" "Tom, just give us the key." Julia's patience was wearing thin. "We both know what's in there." Did we? I almost smiled. Julia thought she knew what was in that safe deposit box, but she was about to learn the difference between assumptions and reality. I stood up slowly, making my way to the kitchen where we kept important keys in a small ceramic bowl. Julia and Val followed, watching my every movement like I might suddenly bolt for the door. The safe deposit box key was exactly where it had always been, nestled between our spare car keys and the key to our storage unit. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in my palm. "This is everything?" Val asked, examining the single key. "That's it. Box 847, First National Bank, downtown branch." Julia reached for the key, but I pulled my hand back slightly. "Before I give you this, I want to understand what's happening here. Are you divorcing me, Julia?" For the first time since they'd arrived, Julia's composure cracked. I saw uncertainty flicker across her face, followed quickly by something that might have been guilt. "Tom, this isn't about divorce. It's about protecting our assets during a difficult time in our marriage." "Protecting them from what?" "From potential complications," Val interjected smoothly. "Your wife has concerns about the security of certain investments and documents. This is simply a precautionary measure." Precautionary measure. Right. I looked at Julia, really looked at her, and saw a stranger wearing my wife's face. This woman who'd shared my bed for 22 years, who'd given birth to our children, who'd promised to love me through better and worse, was standing in our kitchen with a hired gun, planning to steal my inheritance. "Okay," I said, holding out the key. "Take it." Julia's hand trembled slightly as she took the key from my palm. Whatever she'd expected, my cooperation wasn't it. "Tom, I want you to know this isn't personal," she said softly. I almost laughed. "Julia, this is the most personal thing you could possibly do." Val was already moving toward the door, briefcase in hand, clearly eager to get to the bank before I changed my mind or did something to complicate their plan. "We'll be in touch," she said over her shoulder. After they left, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, listening to the silence. Then I walked to my office and opened the laptop I kept separate from my main work computer. The screen displayed a live feed from a small camera I'd installed in the bank's parking garage 3 days ago, positioned with a perfect view of the entrance to First National. I'd learned a long time ago that the best defense against any attack was knowing it was coming before your opponent knew they were launching it. Julia thought she was executing a surprise assault on my assets. In reality, she was walking into a trap I'd been preparing since the moment I discovered her research into safe deposit box procedures. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Mom left with some woman in a suit. Everything okay?" I typed back, "Everything's fine. See you after school." Everything was better than fine. Everything was going exactly according to plan. At 2:15 p.m., I watched through my laptop screen as Julia and Val emerged from their car in the bank parking garage. They moved with the confident stride of people who believed they were about to claim a significant victory. Julia was practically bouncing on her toes as they entered the bank. I'd visited that safe deposit box 2 days ago, making some final preparations. The inheritance documents Julia expected to find were gone, moved to a more secure location. In their place, I'd left something much more interesting. Copies of every text message between Julia and Peter, printouts of her email correspondence with Val Morrison, and a detailed timeline of her affair, complete with photographic evidence. But the real surprise was the letter I'd written, addressed to Julia personally. In it, I'd laid out everything I knew about her plans, her relationship with Peter, and her attempts to manipulate our divorce proceedings. I'd also included some information about Peter that I doubted Julia knew, like his previous affair with a married client that had resulted in a significant lawsuit, or his creative approach to expense reporting that bordered on embezzlement. The letter ended with a simple message. If you wanted a war, you should have chosen a better battlefield. My phone rang at 2:47 p.m. Julia's number. "Hello?" I answered calmly. "Tom?" Her voice was shaking. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not over the phone. Can you meet us at the bank?" "Is there a problem?" Silence stretched between us, and I could hear Val's voice in the background, sharp and urgent. "Tom, what did you do? I gave you the key, just like you asked. Did you find what you were looking for?" More silence. Then, "You son of a—" The line went quiet. Julia had hung up, but not before I'd heard the rage and panic in her voice. Phase 1 was complete. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a moment of satisfaction. Julia had spent weeks planning her strategic divorce, consulting with attorneys, researching asset division, positioning herself for maximum financial gain. She'd thought she was playing chess while I was playing checkers. She was about to learn that I'd been playing a completely different game altogether. My phone buzzed with another call, this time from a number I didn't recognize. "Tom Dillon." "Mr. Dillon, this is Val Morrison. We need to discuss the contents of your safe deposit box." "What about them?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The materials you left there constitute harassment and potentially criminal invasion of privacy." I laughed, a sound that seemed to echo strangely in my quiet office. "Ms. Morrison, every document in that box consists of communications sent by your client or activities she conducted in public spaces. There's nothing illegal about documenting someone's behavior when they're having an affair. Mr. Dillon, I strongly advise you to—" "Ms. Morrison," I interrupted, "I strongly advise you to counsel your client about the legal implications of adultery in divorce proceedings, especially when combined with attempts to hide marital assets and manipulate court orders." I hung up before she could respond. The next few hours passed quietly. I worked on legitimate client projects, answered emails, and prepared dinner for the kids. Normal activities that felt surreal given the drama unfolding downtown. Emma arrived home first, dropping her backpack by the door with her usual teenage carelessness. "Dad? Where's Mom?" "She's handling some business matters. She'll be home later." Emma studied my face with that uncomfortable perceptiveness she'd inherited from me. What kind of business matters? Adult stuff. How was school? She wasn't buying the deflection, but she let it slide. Fine. Are you cooking tonight? Looks like it. Any requests? Something that doesn't involve Mom's passive-aggressive commentary about your seasoning choices. I paused, in the middle of opening the refrigerator. Has your mother been critical of my cooking? Dad, Mom's been critical of everything you do for months. Haven't you noticed? I had noticed, but hearing it from Emma made it more real somehow. Such as the way you load the dishwasher, your choice of television shows, how you dress for company events, the fact that you prefer staying home to going out. Emma counted on her fingers. Should I continue? When did you become so observant? When my parents started acting like strangers who happened to live in the same house. Max walked in before I could respond, saving me from a conversation I wasn't ready to have. He grunted a greeting and headed straight for the refrigerator, emerging with a sports drink and half a sandwich. Where's Mom? He asked through a mouthful of turkey and cheese. Business meeting, Emma and I said simultaneously. He shrugged and disappeared upstairs, apparently satisfied with the explanation. 15-year-old boys were wonderfully uncomplicated. Julia finally came home at 8:30 p.m., long after we'd finished dinner. I was helping Emma with calculus homework when I heard her car in the driveway. Emma looked up from her textbook, and I could see questions forming behind her eyes. Why don't you take a break? I suggested. We can finish this later. Emma gathered her books, but instead of going upstairs, she lingered in the doorway between the kitchen and living room. She wanted to witness whatever was about to happen. Julia entered through the garage door, her professional composure completely gone. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her hands were shaking as she set down her purse. Tom, we need to talk. I'm listening. She glanced toward Emma, who was making no effort to hide her eavesdropping. Privately. Emma, give us a few minutes, I said. My daughter reluctantly headed upstairs, but I knew she'd be listening from the landing. Emma had always been curious about adult conversations, and this one promised to be more interesting than most. Julia sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, helped the kids with homework, and planned family vacations. Now it felt like a negotiating table between opposing armies. What did you think would happen, Tom? I thought you'd find exactly what you were looking for. You humiliated me in front of my attorney. I documented your behavior. There's a difference. Julia's eyes flashed with anger. You had no right to spy on me. I had every right to protect myself when my wife started planning my financial destruction. Financial destruction? Tom, I was trying to secure our assets during a difficult period. By consulting with a divorce attorney behind my back, by researching how to access my inheritance, by having an affair with your business partner. The last accusation hung in the air between us, like a loaded weapon. Julia's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, denial, calculation, and finally resignation. How long have you known? Long enough. She leaned back in her chair, and for a moment she looked older, tired in a way that expensive skincare couldn't hide. It's not what you think. What I think is that you've been planning to leave me while maximizing your financial settlement. What I think is that you've been using Peter Vale as both your lover and your business advisor. What I think is that you underestimated your husband's ability to protect himself. Julia was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. The real Julia, not the polished real estate agent or the calculating wife, but the woman I'd married 22 years ago. Tom, our marriage has been over for years. We both know it. I didn't know it. We're like roommates who happen to share children. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you looked at me like you actually saw me? When was the last time you gave me a reason to? The words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true. Julia had been emotionally absent long before she'd started her affair with Peter. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide how ugly you want this to get." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. You tried to ambush me with a court order and steal my inheritance. You involved attorneys and made this adversarial. I responded accordingly." Julia stood up, her professional mask sliding back into place. "My attorney says you can't use those documents in court. They were obtained illegally. Your attorney is wrong. Everything in that box came from your phone, your email, or public spaces. I never hacked anything, never broke any laws. I just paid attention. Tom, this doesn't have to be a war." "You're right, it doesn't. But you started one anyway." She headed toward the stairs, then paused at the bottom step. "For what it's worth, I never meant for it to happen this way. But you're not sorry it did." She didn't answer, which was answer enough. After Julia went upstairs, I sat alone in the kitchen, processing the conversation. Emma appeared a few minutes later, padding downstairs in her pajamas. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Are you and Mom getting divorced?" I looked at my daughter, 17 years old, college-bound, smart enough to understand that her family was falling apart, but young enough to hope it might somehow be fixable. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Is Mom really having an affair?" "Yes." Emma nodded like she'd expected that answer. "Are you okay?" Was I okay? My marriage was ending, my wife had tried to steal my inheritance, and I was about to engage in a legal and social war that would affect my children's lives for years to come. "I will be," I said, and I meant it. Because while Julia had been planning her exit strategy, I'd been planning something much more comprehensive. She wanted a divorce? Fine. She wanted to play strategic games with our assets? I could play that game better than she'd ever imagined. Julia thought she'd been preparing for battle. She had no idea that the war had already begun, and she was losing. The Prestige Properties annual charity auction was held every spring at the Riverside Country Club, a gathering of the city's real estate elite to raise money for local charities while networking and showing off their latest successes. Julia had been looking forward to it for months, seeing it as an opportunity to solidify her professional relationships and, I suspected, make her affair with Peter more publicly acceptable by gradually introducing him as her close friend and business partner. She had no idea I'd be attending as well. "Tom, you hate these events," Julia said when I mentioned my plans to join her. We were in our bedroom, getting ready for what would likely be our last public appearance as a married couple. "I thought it might be nice to support your career," I said, adjusting my tie in the mirror. "Besides, I've been thinking about our conversation the other night. Maybe I haven't been paying enough attention to the things that matter to you." Julia paused in applying her lipstick, studying my reflection. She looked stunning in a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her blonde hair styled in elegant waves. For a moment, I remembered why I'd fallen in love with her 22 years ago. "That's unexpected," she said carefully. "I'm full of surprises." If she only knew. The country club was decorated with spring flowers and soft lighting, creating an atmosphere of refined elegance. Round tables filled the main ballroom, each set with fine china and crystal glasses. A small stage at the front held the auction podium, and silent auction items lined the walls. Vacation packages, artwork, jewelry, and other luxury items donated by local businesses. Julia and I made our entrance together, playing the role of the successful married couple for the benefit of her colleagues and clients. She introduced me to people I'd met dozens of times at previous events, her hand resting lightly on my arm in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt performative. Peter Vale was holding court near the bar, surrounded by a group of agents and clients. He looked exactly like what he was, a smooth-talking salesman in an expensive suit, with the kind of artificial charm that worked well in real estate, but felt hollow in person. When he saw Julia and me approaching, His smile faltered for just a moment before returning to full wattage. "Tom, great to see you, buddy." Peter extended his hand with aggressive friendliness. "Julia said you might not make it tonight." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Julia speaks so highly of her business partnership with you." "Partnership," Peter repeated, his eyes flicking between Julia and me. "Right. We work very well together." "I'm sure you do." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, full of the kind of meaningless small talk that filled these events. But I could see the tension beneath the surface. Peter's slightly too bright smile, Julia's careful positioning to avoid standing too close to him, the way they avoided making eye contact with each other. Sarah Whitman appeared at Julia's elbow, drink already in hand despite the early hour. Sarah was Julia's closest friend and biggest enabler, a bitter divorcee who viewed all marriages as temporary arrangements that ended badly for the women involved. "Tom, how nice that you decided to join us," Sarah said with false sweetness. "Julia was just saying how busy you've been with work lately." "Business is good," I replied, "though I always make time for the important things." "Such a devoted husband," Sarah said, and I caught the slight smirk she shared with Julia. The evening progressed with typical charity auction rhythm: cocktails, dinner, speeches about community service, and then the main event. I bid on a few items, making casual conversation with other attendees, playing the role of the supportive spouse while observing the social dynamics around Julia and Peter. They were careful. I had to give them credit. No obvious displays of affection, no lingering touches, no secret glances across the room. But I'd been watching them for weeks now, and I could see the subtle signs. The way Peter's attention always drifted back to Julia, how she unconsciously mirrored his movements, the private smile she wore when she thought no one was looking. The auction was in full swing when I made my move. The current item was a weekend getaway package to a luxury resort, and the bidding was spirited. I waited until the auctioneer called for final bids, then stood up. "Before we continue," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "I have something I'd like to share with everyone." The auctioneer looked confused, but the crowd turned their attention to me with the kind of curiosity that came from unexpected disruption to a familiar routine. "Tom, what are you doing?" Julia whispered urgently. "I wanted to take a moment to appreciate my wife and her business partner," I said, pulling out my phone. "Julia and Peter have been working so closely together lately, and I thought everyone should hear how dedicated they are to their partnership." I pressed play on the audio file I'd prepared, a compilation of Julia's voicemails to Peter, carefully edited to remove any explicit content, but leaving the intimate tone and suggestive language intact. "Peter, I can't stop thinking about our meeting yesterday." Julia's voice filled the room through the sound system I'd accessed earlier. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye in the room turned toward Julia and Peter, who looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. "Tom, stop this!" Julia hissed, but her voice was lost in the murmur of shocked whispers spreading through the crowd. The recording continued for another 30 seconds, just long enough to make the nature of their relationship unmistakably clear, but not long enough to become genuinely obscene. When it ended, the silence in the room was deafening. "I'm sorry," I said into the microphone, my voice filled with false contrition. "I must have hit the wrong button on my phone. Technology, right?" I sat down, leaving Julia and Peter to face a room full of their colleagues, clients, and competitors who now knew exactly what kind of business partnership they'd been conducting. Peter was the first to recover, his salesman instincts kicking in. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I said, standing again, "is thinking that adultery stays private in the digital age." Julia grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my sleeve. "We're leaving. Now. Actually, I think I'll stay for the rest of the auction." I'm still interested in that resort package. But Julia was already moving toward the exit, her face flushed with humiliation and rage. Peter followed, abandoning his attempt at damage control. Sarah Whitman hurried after them, shooting me a look of pure venom as she passed. The rest of the evening was surreal. Some people avoided me like I was contagious, while others approached with barely concealed curiosity, fishing for more details about my marriage. I played the role of the wounded husband perfectly, dignified, slightly sad, but not bitter. "I'm sorry you had to witness that," I told several people. "I thought I'd deleted that recording. Julia's been going through a difficult time lately, and I've been trying to be understanding, but—" I let the sentence trail off, allowing people to draw their own conclusions. By the end of the night, the story had evolved in the telling. Julia wasn't just having an affair, she was having a breakdown. Peter wasn't just unprofessional, he was predatory. And I wasn't just a betrayed husband, I was a saint for putting up with it as long as I had. I drove home alone, leaving Julia to find her own way back from what had undoubtedly been the most humiliating night of her professional life. The house was quiet when I arrived. Emma was at a friend's house and Max was spending the weekend at his cousin's place. I poured myself a drink and sat in my home office, pulling up social media on my computer. The story was already spreading online. Someone had recorded my accidental audio playback and posted it on Facebook. The Prestige Properties gossip network was in full swing, with speculation and commentary flying across multiple platforms. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Dad, Jenna's mom just called her about something that happened at Mom's work thing. Are you okay?" I typed back, "I'm fine. We'll talk when you get home tomorrow." Another text, this one from my brother in California. "Dude, what the hell is happening? Mom called me about some drama with Julia." News traveled fast in small social circles. By morning, half the city would know that Julia Dillon was having an affair with her business partner. By Monday, it would affect both of their professional reputations in ways that would take years to repair. Julia came home around midnight, entering through the front door like she was walking into enemy territory. I was still in my office, but I could hear her moving through the house, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors. "Tom," she called, "in here." She appeared in my doorway, still wearing her cocktail dress but looking like she'd aged 10 years since dinner. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and her hands were shaking. "How could you do that to me?" "Do what?" "You humiliated me in front of everyone I work with, my clients, my colleagues, my boss. They all heard that recording." I apologized. I said it was an accident. "Accident?" Her voice rose to near shouting. "You planned that whole thing." "Julia, you're being paranoid. I was trying to share a nice message about your partnership with Peter, and I accidentally played the wrong file. The wrong file that just happened to be a compilation of private voicemails?" "I don't know what you mean." She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to process what was happening. The Julia I'd married was smart, but she'd gotten comfortable over the years, used to being the one with more social intelligence, more strategic thinking. She was realizing that her husband wasn't the predictable, passive man she'd thought she was manipulating. "This is war, isn't it?" she said quietly. "You started it." "Tom, we can still handle this like adults. We can get divorced quietly, split our assets fairly, and co-parent the kids without destroying each other." "That ship sailed when you tried to steal my inheritance." "I wasn't trying to steal anything. I was protecting our joint assets during a difficult time. With the help of your lover and your divorce attorney." Julia leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking exhausted. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand that actions have consequences. You wanted to play strategic games with our marriage? Fine. But you're playing against someone who thinks strategically for a living. So, what happens next? That depends on how reasonable you want to be." She studied my face, looking for some sign of the man she'd been married to for 22 years. I could see the moment when she realized that person was gone, replaced by someone who viewed their relationship as a problem to be solved rather than a marriage to be saved. "I'm staying at Sarah's tonight," she said finally. "Good idea." After she left, I sat alone in the quiet house, processing what had happened. The charity auction had been a calculated strike designed to destroy Julia's professional reputation and social standing. But it was just the opening move in a longer game. Julia thought she could divorce me quietly, take half of everything, and start fresh with Peter Vale. She had no idea that I'd been documenting every aspect of their affair, every financial irregularity in Peter's business dealings, every strategic mistake they'd made in their planning. The safe deposit box incident had been about showing Julia that I knew what she was doing. The charity auction had been about showing her social circle who she really was. But the real war was just beginning, and I had weapons she hadn't even imagined yet. My phone buzzed with another text, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "Tom, this is David Mitchell. I heard about what happened tonight. Call me if you need to talk. I might be able to help." David Mitchell. I remembered him from high school. We'd been friends before he'd joined the police force and I'd gone into IT. I'd heard he'd left the force a few years ago and started working as a private investigator. I saved his number and made a mental note to call him in the morning. If Julia wanted to escalate this conflict, I was going to need all the help I could get. But as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. For the first time since discovering Julia's betrayal, I was looking forward to tomorrow. The game was just getting started. David Mitchell looked exactly like what central casting would order for ex-cop turned private investigator: graying hair, weathered face, and the kind of steady gaze that came from years of dealing with people at their worst. We met at a coffee shop downtown, far from the suburban social circles where Julia and I conducted our increasingly public war. "Tom Dillon," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Been a while since high school." "David, thanks for reaching out." We settled into a corner booth, and David studied me with professional interest. "I heard about the charity auction. That was either brilliant or completely insane." "Maybe both." "Julia's not taking it well, I assume." "That would be an understatement." David pulled out a small notebook, the kind cops used for field interviews. "Tell me what you need." I'd been thinking about that question since his text the night before. What did I need? Legal protection, certainly. Documentation of Julia's affair and financial planning. Evidence of Peter's business irregularities. But more than that, I needed someone who understood how these situations typically played out. "I need to know everything," I said. "About Julia, about Peter, about what they're planning next." "That's a broad request." "Julia tried to steal my inheritance using a court order. She's been planning this divorce for months, maybe longer. And her business partner isn't just her lover. I think he's been advising her on the financial aspects." David made notes as I talked, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and whistled softly. "Tom, you realize you're describing a conspiracy to commit fraud?" "I realize I'm describing my wife trying to take everything I've worked for while having an affair with her business partner." "Same thing, legally speaking." David closed his notebook. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" "I don't know. Julia's staying at her friend Sarah's place for now, but that's temporary. She'll need to make her next move soon." "And you want to be ready for it?" "I want to be 3 steps ahead of it." David smiled, and I caught a glimpse of the friend I'd known in high school. "I can work with that. But Tom, I need to ask, how far are you willing to take this?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you looking for a clean divorce with favorable terms, or are you looking to completely destroy your wife and her lover?" The question hung between us like a loaded weapon. A month ago, I would have said I just wanted a fair settlement and joint custody of the kids. But a month ago, I hadn't known that my wife was capable of the kind of calculated betrayal she'd been planning. "I want them to understand that actions have consequences," I said finally. "That's not an answer. It's the only answer I can give right now." David nodded like he understood. "Fair enough. Let me do some preliminary research, see what I can find. I'll be in touch in a few days." We shook hands and parted ways, but as I walked back to my car, I had the strange feeling that I'd just crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Hiring a private investigator felt different from my own amateur surveillance. It made the situation more official, more serious, more dangerous. The next few days passed in an odd kind of normalcy. Julia stayed at Sarah's place, communicating with me only through text messages about practical matters, picking up clothes, scheduling time with the kids, coordinating household responsibilities. Emma and Max knew something was wrong, but they were handling it with typical teenage adaptability. "Is Mom coming home soon?" Max asked during dinner on Wednesday. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Are you guys getting divorced?" Emma's question was more direct, as usual. "We're working through some problems." "Problems like Mom's affair with her business partner?" I nearly choked on my water. "Emma, where did you hear that?" "Dad, I'm 17, not 7. Half my friends' parents were at that charity thing. The story's all over social media." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw an adult trapped in a teenager's body. She was handling her parents' marital breakdown with more maturity than most adults would have managed. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Are you?" "I'm working on it." "Good, because Max and I need at least one functional parent right now." Thursday afternoon, David called with his preliminary findings. "We need to meet," he said. "And Tom, you're going to want to sit down for this conversation." We met at the same coffee shop, but this time David looked grim. He slid a manila folder across the table without preamble. "Peter Vale is not who you think he is," he said. I opened the folder and found copies of court documents, newspaper articles, and financial records. The top sheet was a criminal complaint from 3 years ago. Peter Vale, charged with embezzlement from his previous real estate firm. "The charges were dropped," David explained. "Insufficient evidence, and the complainants suddenly withdrew their cooperation. But the pattern is interesting." I flipped through more documents. Peter had worked for 4 different real estate firms in the past 8 years, leaving each one under circumstances that ranged from suspicious to openly hostile. "He's a con artist," I said. "More specifically, he's a con artist who specializes in targeting successful women in real estate. Older female agents with established client bases, access to company resources, and enough financial assets to make the relationship worthwhile. And Julia fits that profile perfectly. Julia fits that profile like it was written specifically for her." I studied a photograph of Peter with another woman, taken at what looked like a company event. She was blonde, well-dressed, probably in her late 30s or early 40s. She looked remarkably similar to Julia. "Who's this?" "Margaret Chen, Peter's previous business partner at Henderson Realty. Their affair lasted about 18 months before she discovered he'd been stealing from her clients' escrow accounts." "What happened to her?" "Divorced, bankrupted, and currently working as a receptionist at a dental office in Phoenix." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "David, Julia has access to client funds at Prestige Properties." "I know. That's why we need to move fast." David pulled out another set of documents. "I've been monitoring Peter's financial activity since you hired me. He's made some interesting purchases lately. Expensive jewelry, a down payment on a condo in Florida, and a very large cash withdrawal 2 days ago." "How large?" $47,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $47,000 was almost exactly the amount Julia had in her personal savings account, money she'd accumulated from real estate commissions over the past 2 years. "He's getting ready to run," I said. "That would be my assessment." The question is whether he's planning to take Julia with him or leave her holding the bag. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. Julia thought she was having an affair with her business partner while planning a strategic divorce. In reality, she was being manipulated by a professional con artist who'd probably been targeting her from the moment he'd joined Prestige Properties. "There's more," David said quietly. "More what?" "Tom, I think Julia's in real danger here. Not physical danger, but legal and financial danger that could destroy her life." He pulled out another document, a copy of a real estate transaction from 6 months ago. Julia's name was on it as the listing agent, but something about the numbers looked wrong. "This is the Morrison property sale," David explained. "High-end house, sold for $1.2 million. Julia's commission should have been about $36,000. Okay. But according to the escrow records, there was an additional $40,000 consulting fee paid to Peter Vale for specialized marketing services." I stared at the document. "That's not legal, is it?" "Not even close. It's fraud. And if the state real estate commission finds out about it, Julia could lose her license and face criminal charges." The pieces were falling into place, creating a picture that was much worse than simple adultery. Peter wasn't just having an affair with Julia, he was using her to commit fraud while positioning himself to disappear when the scheme collapsed. "How many transactions?" I asked. "I've found evidence of irregularities in at least 6 sales over the past 8 months. Total amount diverted to Peter is probably close to $200,000. And Julia? Julia either knows about it and is complicit, or she's being used and has no idea how much trouble she's in." I thought about my wife, the woman I'd been married to for 22 years. Julia was many things: ambitious, sometimes ruthless, increasingly distant. But she wasn't stupid. Could she really be unaware that her lover was using her to commit fraud? "David, I need to know which one it is. Is Julia a victim or a co-conspirator?" "That's going to take more investigation. But Tom, there's something else you need to consider." "What?" "If Peter is getting ready to disappear, and if Julia is complicit in the fraud, she might be planning to disappear with him." The thought hit me like ice water. Julia leaving me for another man was one thing. Julia abandoning our children to flee criminal charges was something else entirely. "The kids," I said. "Exactly. If Julia runs, you'll have full custody by default. But if she gets arrested for fraud, the scandal could affect Emma and Max for years." I closed the folder and pushed it back across the table. "What do you recommend?" "We have 2 options. Option 1, we take this information to the authorities and let them handle it. Julia gets arrested, Peter probably flees, and your kids spend their teenage years dealing with the fact that their mother is a convicted felon. Option 2, we handle it ourselves. We use this information to control the situation, protect the kids, and make sure Peter Vale gets what he deserves without destroying Julia in the process." "And what does Julia get?" David's smile was cold. "Julia gets to learn the difference between consequences and mercy." I sat in silence for a moment, weighing my options. A month ago, my biggest concern had been whether Julia was losing interest in our marriage. Now I was deciding whether to have her arrested for fraud or give her a chance to escape the consequences of her own choices. "How long do we have?" "Based on Peter's activity patterns, I'd say a week, maybe 2 before he makes his move." "Then we better get started." As I drove home, I thought about the conversation I was going to have with Emma and Max. They deserved to know that their mother was in serious trouble, but they didn't deserve to know all the details of how she'd gotten there. More importantly, I needed to decide what kind of man I wanted to be. The husband who'd been betrayed and humiliated, the father protecting his children, or something else entirely? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made my decision. Julia had chosen to play a dangerous game with dangerous people, but she was still the mother of my children, and despite everything she'd done, I wasn't going to let Peter Vale destroy her life just to get his revenge on me, which meant I was going to have to destroy him first. The storm that hit our city that Friday night seemed almost theatrical in its timing, as if nature itself was providing the perfect backdrop for the final act of my marriage's destruction. Rain lashed against the windows of my home office as I made the last preparations for what I'd come to think of as the Peter Vale solution. David had called that morning with urgent news. Peter was accelerating his timeline. He'd booked a flight to Miami for Sunday morning, and more importantly, he'd convinced Julia to liquidate her retirement account. The withdrawal was scheduled for first thing Monday morning, nearly $200,000 that would disappear along with Peter if I didn't act fast. He's not planning to take her with him, David had said. The flight's booked under a single name, and he's been texting another woman in Florida. Julia's just his final score before he disappears, which meant I had less than 48 hours to save my wife from financial ruin while simultaneously destroying the man who'd been manipulating her for months. The irony wasn't lost on me. After everything Julia had done, the affair, the attempted theft of my inheritance, the public humiliation, I was still trying to protect her. Maybe it was because she was the mother of my children. Maybe it was because 22 years of marriage doesn't disappear overnight, even when it ends badly. Or maybe it was because I'd realized that Peter Vale was a bigger villain than my unfaithful wife had ever been. Emma knocked on my office door around 8 p.m., interrupting my planning. "Dad, there's someone here to see you." I looked up from my computer, where I'd been reviewing David's surveillance photos of Peter's activities. "Who?" "Mom. She's in the kitchen and she looks terrible." I found Julia sitting at our kitchen table, still wearing her real estate blazer but looking like she'd aged 10 years since the charity auction. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged, and her hands were shaking as she clutched a cup of coffee. "Tom, we need to talk." "I'm listening." "Peter's leaving town." "I know." She looked up sharply. "You know?" "Julia, I've known about Peter's plans longer than you have." "Then you know he's been stealing from my clients." That surprised me. I'd expected to have to reveal Peter's fraud myself, but apparently Julia had discovered it on her own. "How long have you known?" I asked. "I figured it out 3 days ago. I was reviewing some old transactions for a client inquiry, and the numbers didn't add up." She took a shaky sip of coffee. "Tom, I could lose my license. I could go to prison. Are you complicit?" "No." Her answer was immediate and emphatic. "I had no idea what he was doing until this week, but my name is on those transactions. My signature is on the paperwork." I sat down across from her, studying her face. Julia was many things, but she'd never been a good liar. I could see genuine fear in her eyes, along with something that might have been regret. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want to know if you're going to turn me in." "Should I?" "Tom, I made mistakes. Huge mistakes. I betrayed our marriage. I tried to manipulate our divorce, and I trusted the wrong person. But I never stole money from my clients." "You just had an affair with the man who did." "Yes." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "And now I have to live with the consequences of that choice." I leaned back in my chair, watching my wife fall apart at our kitchen table. A month ago, I would have comforted her, would have tried to fix whatever was wrong. Now I felt only a cold calculation about how to use this situation to my advantage. "Where's Peter now?" "At his apartment packing. He asked me to come with him." "Are you going?" "No. Tom, whatever else I've done, I'm not abandoning my children." "But you were willing to abandon your husband." Julia flinched like I'd slapped her. "Yes, I was. And I'm sorry for that." An apology. After everything that had happened, Julia was finally apologizing. It should have meant something, but it felt hollow, too little and too late. "Julia, Peter's been playing a long game with you. You're not his first victim, and you wouldn't have been his last." "What do you mean?" I pulled out my phone and showed her one of David's surveillance photos, Peter having dinner with another woman, his hand resting intimately on hers. This was taken Tuesday night, while you were staying at Sarah's place. Julia stared at the photo, and I watched her face cycle through emotions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally a kind of bitter understanding. He never loved me. No. He targeted you because you fit a specific profile: successful female real estate agent, established client base, access to company funds, and a marriage that was already showing cracks. How do you know all this? Because I hired a private investigator to protect myself when you tried to steal my inheritance. What I found was much bigger than adultery. Julia was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When she looked up, I saw something I hadn't seen in months: the woman I'd married, not the polished professional or the calculating adulteress, but the real Julia underneath all the pretense. Tom, I need your help. To do what? To stop him before he ruins both of us. Both of us. Peter knows about your inheritance. He knows about our assets, our investments, everything. If he gets desperate enough, he might try to implicate you in the fraud. That was a possibility David and I hadn't considered. Peter was smart enough to realize that a wealthy husband would make a convenient scapegoat for his crimes. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we work together to make sure Peter Vale gets what he deserves. I studied my wife's face, looking for signs of manipulation or deception, but all I saw was fear, desperation, and maybe the first genuine emotion she'd shown me in months. Julia, if we do this, it doesn't fix our marriage. I know. It doesn't undo the affair, or the lies, or the attempt to steal my inheritance. I know. And it doesn't mean I'm going to make your divorce easy or financially comfortable. I understand. Then what's in it for you? The chance to protect my children from having a mother who's either a convicted felon or a fugitive from justice. I looked at Julia, really looked at her, and saw something I'd almost forgotten existed. The woman who'd fought to get pregnant with Emma after 2 miscarriages, who'd worked 60-hour weeks to help pay for our first house, who'd held my hand during my father's funeral 2 years ago. That woman was still there, buried under months of bad decisions and worse judgment, but still there. Okay, I said, but we do this my way. What do you have in mind? I smiled, and Julia actually recoiled slightly at the expression on my face. We're going to give Peter exactly what he's been asking for. The plan I outlined to Julia was simple in concept, but complex in execution. Peter wanted to disappear with stolen money, fine, but he was going to do it in a way that exposed his crimes, protected Julia from prosecution, and ensured he'd never be able to hurt another family. You're going to call Peter, I explained. Tell him you've changed your mind about leaving town. You want to go with him, but you need 1 more day to arrange things with the kids. He won't believe that. He will if you sell it right. Tell him you're scared about the fraud investigation, that you think running is your only option. And then? Then you're going to suggest meeting at his apartment tomorrow night to finalize your escape plans. You'll bring the money from your retirement account as proof of your commitment. Julia's eyes widened. Tom, that's my entire retirement savings. No, it's bait. The money will never leave the bank. I explained the rest of the plan, watching Julia's expression shift from confusion to understanding to something that might have been admiration. That's incredibly devious, she said. I learned from the best. Saturday passed in a blur of preparation. David coordinated with contacts in law enforcement, ensuring that Peter's crimes would be properly documented and prosecuted. I worked with our bank to set up the financial trap that would expose Peter's fraud while protecting Julia's assets. And Julia played her role perfectly, convincing Peter that she was ready to abandon everything and flee with him. By Saturday evening, everything was in place. Peter was expecting Julia at his apartment at 9 p.m., believing she was bringing $200,000 in cash for their escape. Instead, he was going to get a very different kind of surprise. The storm intensified as evening approached, turning the streets into rivers and making driving hazardous. Perfect weather for what I had planned. At 8:30, Julia and I sat in my car outside Peter's apartment complex, watching his windows through the rain-soaked windshield. "Are you sure about this?" Julia asked. "Too late for second thoughts now." "Tom, after tonight, what happens to us?" I looked at my wife, this woman who'd shared my life for 22 years, who'd betrayed me in the worst possible way, and who was now trusting me to save her from the consequences of her own choices. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But whatever happens, we'll handle it like adults who respect each other." "Even after everything?" "Especially after everything." Julia nodded and got out of the car, walking toward Peter's building with the careful steps of someone trying not to slip on wet pavement. I watched her disappear into the lobby, then pulled out my phone to coordinate with David. "She's inside," I texted. "Units are in position," he replied. "Give her 10 minutes, then we move." Those 10 minutes felt like hours. I sat in my car, listening to the storm and thinking about how different my life was going to be after tonight. No matter how this played out, my marriage to Julia was over. The trust was gone, the respect was damaged, and too much had happened for us to ever go back to what we'd been. But maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe we'd both grown into people who needed different things from life. Maybe this was just the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. My phone buzzed with a text from Julia. "He's here, starting the recording." Julia was wearing a wire, courtesy of David's law enforcement contacts. Everything Peter said tonight would be documented, admissible in court, and sufficient to ensure his prosecution for fraud, embezzlement, and whatever other charges the district attorney wanted to pursue. 5 minutes later, another text. "He's confessing everything. Thinks I'm impressed by how clever he's been." Peter's arrogance was going to be his downfall. He couldn't resist bragging about his crimes, especially to someone he thought was going to be his partner in escape. At exactly 9:40 p.m., David's signal came through. "Go." I got out of my car and walked toward Peter's building, rain soaking through my jacket within seconds. The lobby was empty, and I took the elevator to the 3rd floor, my footsteps echoing in the hallway as I approached apartment 3B. I could hear voices through the door, Peter's confident baritone and Julia's carefully modulated responses. She was playing her role perfectly, asking just the right questions to get him to incriminate himself further. I knocked on the door, 3 sharp raps that cut through their conversation like a blade. "Peter, it's Tom Dillon, we need to talk." Silence from inside the apartment, then the sound of rapid movement and whispered conversation. "Peter, I know you're in there. I know Julia's with you, and I know about the money you've been stealing." The door opened, revealing Peter in a state of panic I'd never seen before. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and his face was flushed with anger and fear. "Tom, this isn't what it looks like." "It looks like you've been committing fraud while having an affair with my wife." "That's not—" "Julia, tell him—" Julia appeared behind Peter, and I could see the recording device David had given her clipped discreetly to her jacket. She looked calm, almost serene, like she'd finally found some kind of peace with her situation. "Hello, Tom." "Julia, are you ready to go home?" "Yes. I think I am." Peter's face went through a series of expressions as he realized what was happening. "Julia, what the hell?" "Peter, meet my husband, the IT security consultant who's been documenting your crimes for the past 2 weeks." I pulled out my phone and showed Peter a photo David had taken of him withdrawing cash from Julia's account that morning. $47,000. That's a felony, Peter. You can't prove anything. Actually, I can prove everything. Bank records, surveillance footage, recorded conversations, witness testimony from your previous victims. I stepped closer to Peter, close enough to see the sweat beading on his forehead. "Did you really think you could steal from my wife and not have me notice?" "Tom, we can work this out. Julia and we made mistakes, but—" "Julia made mistakes. You committed crimes. There's a difference." Peter looked between Julia and me, finally understanding that he'd been outmaneuvered. "Julia, you're making a huge mistake. If you stay with him, you'll be implicated in everything." "No, she won't," I said, "because Julia's been cooperating with law enforcement for the past week. Everything you've told her, everything you've confessed to, it's all been recorded." The color drained from Peter's face. "You're bluffing." Julia pulled the recording device from her jacket and held it up. "Peter, tell Tom about the Morrison property. Tell him how you stole $40,000 from that transaction." "Julia, don't—" "Tell him about Margaret Chen. Tell him about the other women you've done this to." Peter's composure finally cracked completely. "You manipulative witch! You think you can just—" He lunged toward Julia, but I was ready for him. I grabbed his arm and twisted it behind his back, using a restraint technique David had taught me that afternoon. "Peter Vale, you're under citizen's arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and attempted assault. You can't do this." "Actually, I can. David?" David Mitchell stepped through the apartment door, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. Peter's face went white as he realized how thoroughly he'd been trapped. "Peter Vale," David said, producing handcuffs, "you're under arrest for multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent." As David read Peter his rights, I looked around the apartment. Suitcases were packed and ready by the door. Airline tickets to Miami were spread across the coffee table. A briefcase full of cash, Julia's money, sat open on the kitchen counter. "Julia," I said, "are you okay?" "I'm okay." She was watching Peter being handcuffed with an expression of profound relief. "Tom, I need you to know—" "We'll talk later. Right now, let's get you home." As we walked out of Peter's apartment building, the storm was beginning to clear. Rain still fell, but lighter now, and I could see stars appearing between the clouds. "Tom," Julia said as we reached my car, "what happens now?" "Now you testify against Peter. You cooperate with the district attorney's investigation. You rebuild your career and your reputation." "And us?" I looked at my wife, this woman who'd betrayed me and manipulated me and tried to steal from me, but who'd also just helped me bring down a man who would have destroyed other families if we hadn't stopped him. "Us is over, Julia, but we're still Emma and Max's parents, and we're still going to be part of each other's lives for a long time. Can you ever forgive me?" "I don't know, but I can respect you for doing the right thing tonight." Julia nodded, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. "That's more than I deserve. Maybe. But it's what I'm offering." As we drove home through the storm-cleared streets, I thought about the future. Emma and Max would need time to adjust to their parents' divorce, but they'd be okay. They were strong kids, and they had 2 parents who loved them, even if those parents couldn't love each other anymore. Julia would rebuild her life, probably in another city where Peter's scandal hadn't touched her reputation. She was talented and determined, and she'd find a way to succeed again. And me? I'd learned something important about myself over the past month. I was stronger than I'd thought, smarter than my enemies had assumed, and capable of protecting the people I cared about when it mattered most. Peter Vale was going to prison for a long time. Julia was safe from prosecution and free to start over. My children were protected from the worst consequences of their mother's choices. It wasn't the ending I'd planned when I'd married Julia 22 years ago, but it was an ending I could live with. As I pulled into our driveway, I saw Emma waiting at the front window, watching for us to come home. Tomorrow, Julia and I would sit down with our children and explain that sometimes families change shape but don't stop being families. Tonight, we were all just grateful to be safe. The game was over, and everyone who deserved to win had won.